Yeah, as I said, in a way, it's been really interesting thinking about how to approach this evening in terms of my own kind of understanding of Dr. Ambedkar and his life and his work. And so I'm going to, yeah, we're going to spend the next few weeks kind of unpacking this sort of for further developments or aspects of the metta bhavana. The technical term, if you want to go and look it up, is called the Brahma Viharas. So it's a series of 4 meditations. I'll send you a link to this if you want a few links to this. And we're going to start tonight by talking about, I don't use very many Pali or whatever words, but just to tell you. So if you're interested, we're going to start off tonight looking at Karuna. Karuna means kind of compassion. So it's basically, it's like what happened, the creative response to difficulty in life, what is suffering, to put it literally, compassion. So yeah, and as I say, hopefully it is a somewhat heavy subject, just to acknowledge that. So yeah, uh, and so to start off with the heaviness, in a way, one of them, I think I was talking about this on week 1. If I get confused because I forget which class I've talked about things with. So if one way of understanding the Buddhist project is that is the observation that life is, we have this life, and we're presented by by complexity and difficulty. We feel overwhelmed. We're small, the world's big. And so it's a really natural and human response to that, to close down, to protect ourselves, to stay safe. And that's entirely human and natural. But in a way, the core Buddhist perspective is like, actually that closing down is causes us suffering. We close down we try to keep ourselves safe, but in doing that, we separate, we isolate, and we limit ourselves. So the Buddhist project is to reverse that trend. It's to open, it's to become bigger, it's to become more, is to allow ourselves to feel and think fully, to fulfill our potential, to meet the world, to be fully in touch with the world. But of course, that immediately presents us with a very obvious but complex problem. And that is the simple fact that when we come, the more open we are, the more we come into contact with the reality of pain and suffering, and just the difficulty and hardship that is present in this world. And yeah, and in some ways, but yeah, like, I don't want to make light of that. In some ways, Buddhism is just saying, look, it's hard. If we've got 2 choices. We close our eyes to the suffering of this world, which means we can't see and we're isolated, or we open our eyes to the suffering of this world, and it's 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 horrible. It's tragic. Um, like, you just whatever, you just have to look around, don't you? Like, our hearts break with the suffering that is present in this life. So what do we do with that? We're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. We close our eyes, we get isolated. We open our eyes, and we get overwhelmed by the pain and difficulty in this life. That's hard. And so what I'm going to say tonight is, well, it's perspectives and things we do that can help with that. But I really don't want to make light of just the simple fact that it's hard and there's no easy answers. And obviously, I don't know your individual stories. I don't know the people around you in your life. We're all presented with different levels of that can be more or less present in our faces. So as I'm speaking, please, or treat yourselves kindly, particularly if you're surrounded by people who are having a difficult time at the moment, because it's very, very hard. But I think to be fully human is just to try and find some way of facing this and bearing this. And Buddhism definitely presents us with tools and ways to do that. And what I'm going to be talking about over the next few weeks is a really useful tool. But it doesn't suddenly, it's not a magic wand which says, oh, da, there you go, life's all okay now. It's like, God, it sucks. And in some ways, I think one of Buddhism's primary contributions is just the honesty about that. It's just like, man, life is hard. Bad things happen to good people. It is not fair. Life is not fair. So yeah, so yeah, I suppose I just wanted to start with that. So then we've in a way we've got this for like the reality of pain, and then the question is, well, how can we open our eyes to it? How can we open our hearts to that more fully? Um, and yeah, so and Buddhism kind of or the Buddha uses this model of the Brahma Viharas, these kind of four different, for some metta is for basic response, and then you've got these other three responses which help us bear the fullness of human life, both the joy and the sorrow, and the wisdom uh, to really bear it. And as I say, this evening I'm going to focus more on our response to difficulty, but in some ways, partly just because it's too heavy just to talk about that, but also, like the other sides, they'll kind of weave in a little bit. Um, so, as I was saying in the first week, one of the real remarkable features of Dr. Ambedkar was his ability to um, well, to open his heart, if you may or may not remember me telling you this story of, like this decisive experience where he'd kind of gone, he'd kind of like he'd grown up experiencing the difficult childhood, caste and all of that. He'd gone to the States and the UK where he'd had a pleasant life. He'd come back to India. He'd tried to help, and he'd been met by all of this kind of prejudice, oppression, threats of violence towards him. And he's sitting at this station, kind of leaving town because he's being threatened. And he gets really angry, which I think is a completely human response to just, yeah, pain and injustice, totally understandable. But then something else happens, and he asks, and in a way, he has this moment where he says, what's it like for other people? It's not just about me. I'm suffering, but other people are suffering more than me. So that's the first step, is this is a the ability to take in other people's experience, like a care and concern for others. And he asks, and in a way, he asks this question: well, what can I do to help them? So in some ways, this is the core question, isn't it? How can I help? What can I actually do? Well, how can I contribute? So and in a way, I'd like to suggest that. And again, I suppose just to be sensitive, some of what I'm going to say is quite obvious, but also it's like there's no criticism of the fact that we get, like in a way we get this wrong again and again and again, and that's human, that's normal, so don't feel criticized. So in a way, what I'd like to suggest is the core thing is this courageous willingness to see life, to acknowledge the pain and difficulty of our own lives and the lives of others, and then the capacity to say, okay, well, what can I actually do to help? What would actually make a difference here? And and that's not easy. But before we go into why it's not easy, let's just kind of talk about that for a second. So I suppose I'm just going to tell you some stories or give you some examples. So I don't know about you, but as in my 20s, certainly in my 20s, I had this very, very consistent experience that there'd be some kind of charity thing going on, like a this or that or the other. And um, I'd always feel bad, and I'd feel bad because I felt like I had to do something. I had to do more. It's like, oh, I should like do a sponsored parachute jump or a sponsored kind of swimming across the English Channel or whatever, or a sponsored walk around my park. I never did any of those things, and I always felt bad about it. Um, and in some ways, this feeling bad is the opposite. I would suggest that feeling bad about things is the least helpful emotional response. So that's the key thing we want to move away from, because it doesn't help anyone, does it? We all know that. It's like, I feel bad about other people having a bad time, but it doesn't help me, it doesn't help them. So where am I going with this? So, and in a way, I suppose I just want to present a message of hope. So I had that experience very consistently, and then I ended up going to India in 2006, and kind of as part of this kind of Buddhist thing I was doing, and just had this very visceral experience of that was it was the second time I've been to a developing country, but I met many more people. You know, like the first time was just traveling, and you're very insulated and just like looking for bars and chasing girls. And it's like this time I was really like with real people and seeing their lives, and it was, but it was just really, really tough. Basically, it's like um, I just remember I just remember people telling me their stories about their lives, and just finding it really kind of slightly overwhelming, actually. Um, where am I going with this story? But I suppose and I suppose, and I had this experience of helplessness and hopelessness. I didn't know what I could do. I didn't feel like I could do anything, and that kind of closes your heart, doesn't it? So you kind of, your heart opens a bit, but then you're like, I don't know what I can do. That's painful, so you close down again. But what happened when I came back to the UK is I did this for for like treatment in a Buddhist community. One of the things, one of parts of movement is this charity which raises money for India, and I went and did this fundraising appeal for them, which was like, it's quite an investment of time. So it's 6 weeks basically, where you kind of, they pay your rent and you go and live in a city and spend 6 weeks knocking on people's doors and asking them for money and to sign up for their standing orders. Very, very positive experience, although also really hard. My God, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. It's like constant rejection, but also these moments of beauty and connection and people wanting to help. But when I came to the end of it, or some months afterwards, what I noticed is that since that day, actually, I've never had that. I don't feel bad about when, when fundraising appeals go around. I don't feel bad about it anymore, because I've done something. I have actually helped to the extent of my abilities. Like, and I'm really not trying to show off here or anything like that. You know, like, it's like lots of people do this thing. Like, it is a significant investment of time, but it's kind of possible. And they work out the average amount of money doing one of these things raises, and it's £20,000. That's quite a lot of money, isn't it? And it kind of, in some ways, and I suppose this is the point, in my own sort of internal algebra of like money and value, like I don't feel bad about not raising 100 quid for charity or doing a sponsored da-di-da, because I think, well, actually I raised 20 grand, and that goes a long way in India, and that was really worth doing. That really made a difference. um, so yeah, and just to reiterate, I'm not telling this story to kind of show off and say, oh, look at me, aren't I a good and helpful person? The reason I tell the story is because prior to that event, I always had this sort of feel bad feeling, like, oh, I've not done enough, I should do more, blah, 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 blah. And actually, so in a way, I'm telling you that story is because it is possible to kind of answer that. If you have that sort of thought in your mind, which I think most people do, it is possible to kind of do something and that change. And it's like, no, I have done something, I have helped. Um, you might, if you want like a smaller example of that, or like a more immediate thing, I think we can all, I suppose for myself, I just have a really strong confidence that we can, in acting, I suppose this is the point. One of the things that I think gets really strongly in the way is we have this really strong tendency toward these all or nothing stories. It's like, I've got to save someone, I've got to give all my money, I've got to give all of my time, and yeah, it's really not like that, actually. It's whatever we do that helps is worth doing. In a way, that's the core message. And whatever helps us actually do something and not get lost in feeling bad about not doing more, is that's the answer. That's all you have to do. You just have to do something rather than feel bad about not doing more. And yeah, and in a way, that's my core message for this evening. But Dr. Ambedkar did that on a level which is, well, like, era defining, globe shifting. But actually, all of us, that's all we can ever do. And I'm sure, in a way, I'm going to invite you to talk about this in a minute, but we all have little moments of doing that. Like, for example, like, I really like, just as an example, so my response to like the homeless crisis in the UK, much more immediate. I've got two strategies for that. Firstly is, when I remember, I buy something, for like shops where they've got like food banks. So I just buy a bag of 60p pasta every time I go to my local shops and chuck it in the food bank when I remember, which is most of the time. And I really try when I've got, even if it's just a moment or two, to like verbally acknowledge and say hello to homeless people on the street and just say, hi, how's it going? How's it going today? Yeah, did you get a decent night's sleep last night? And like, I'm like, obviously that is not answering the homelessness crisis in the UK. It obviously isn't, but it does do something, you know, like there is money helping those people for, you know, past, well, that's food banks, it's not quite the same, but anyway, it's sort of in my head and my heart, it's the same kind of issue. Giving money to food banks, giving food to food banks does actually make a difference, and saying hello to homeless people does genuinely make a difference, and they appreciate it. So I'm, yeah, so I suppose that, so like in a way, that's my core point, is that I would argue the primary challenge when we're confronted with suffering is that we ping into, we basically, we become self-preoccupied, we become self-referential, and we either say, oh, I can't bear it, I can't see, it's so painful for me, or we think, oh my God, I've got to do everything, I've got to solve all the problems, and then we can't do that, and then we get overwhelmed, and then we withdraw again anyway. So in some ways, what Buddhism is encouraging us to do is just to kind of see, like, look with honesty at the situations we find ourselves in, and ask ourselves a simple question: how can I support you? What can I actually do? And it doesn't matter how small it is, because something is better than nothing. And if that sounds blasé or trite, it's, well, it's true. It is the only truth. That is the only thing that is possible. So just to, yeah, in a way, just to put words, names on that, in a way, what we want to, because in a way, the core Buddhist question is, how can I, how can I be less self-referential about this? How am I being self-referential in the face of suffering? And that might sound a bit critical, but I suppose when I look in my own heart, that's almost always what's going on for me. When I'm either I get overwhelmed or I think I have to fix it all, it's like I'm being self-referential. Actually, it doesn't help. It doesn't help. Um, but sometimes, yeah, I suppose sometimes it's just really overwhelming, isn't it? Sometimes we just, so I, um, yeah, sometimes we just don't know what to do, and we close down and we don't have any choice. So one of the most distressing experiences I had in India was, uh, I was at a small rural train station late at night with a few Indian friends, but I was the only English person. It's in the arse in the middle of nowhere. I was only the Western person, probably for like 100, 200 miles. Like I really was in the arse in the middle of nowhere. This street kid, like this kid who lived on a station platform, basically just kind of started assaulting me, and the kid was just screaming, English person money, English person money, and grace, paisa, paisa. And I was exhausted and overwhelmed. I just didn't know what to do. And I just couldn't respond to this kid. I couldn't, like, well, I suppose I was angry. I was angry with her for, I just felt kind of assaulted, not physically, but emotionally. I couldn't cope. I just walked away. Well, and then she wrapped her arms around my feet, and basically I dragged her several steps across the station before she let go. Like that's grim. I just didn't, I just didn't know what to do. I couldn't cope. I was exhausted. Um, why am I telling you that story? Because sometimes we're just like, can't, can't cope, can't do this, I can't help. And that's, well, that's hard, but that's the reality of the situation. But sometimes we can help, we can do things, and we can make a difference. So I'm gonna ping you off now. So in a way, the question is like, well, what happens for you in the face of difficulty, be that small or large, and particularly maybe talking about, well, does what I was saying about this thing about the challenge, the question is like, what can I do to help? And the challenge is when we make it about us, and we either kind of get overwhelmed and say, oh, I can't bear it, I can't look at you, or we kind of get stuck in this, I've got to do everything, I've got to make it all okay, which then then pings into overwhelm. So those are the two dangers. And yeah, what happens for you in the face of difficulty? And I suppose particularly, do you have moments when you do manage to help? I'm sure we all have moments and ways in which we help.